Hi there, welcome back to 19 Considerations. Today we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video, looking at the development of medicine that brought us to the point we are today. So everything we're discussing really and thinking about really is in light of the current COVID-19 problem, the COVID-19 or the coronavirus pandemic, however you want to describe it. So we looked last time at two potential approaches to medicine and the balance between the two of them. That of Panacea, which is the interventionist, when something is wrong you fix it with a pill, a potion, a powder, a procedure. And Hygieia, who was personified as the sister of Panacea, who really personified the approach of hygiene, physical hygiene, dietary hygiene, mental hygiene, the long-term investment and responsibility for one's own health. And interestingly, as was noted last time, that after the plague of Athens in 430 BC, the cult of Hygieia and her rose to prominence as the populace realised that the approach of Panacea alone failed them during that epidemic, where 75 to 100,000 people perished. So if you fast forward a little bit, to bring a little bit of context into this, I want to look at the process of imperial growth and imperial encroachment into geographical areas. So just very quickly we want to think about Cortés and the Spanish infiltration into South America. We want to think about the British Empire's expanding into particularly South Africa, New Zealand and Australia. And what these processes all had in common was they understood that if you could destroy the indigenous wisdom and the indigenous culture and the indigenous practices, then within a generation or two you could really have complete control over the populace. And also bringing new diseases in helped, as it did in North America, with the genocide to the native populations there, using disease as a weapon. But primarily the idea, particularly espoused, I believe, by the British, was to go after the local wisdom keepers. So in these indigenous cultures, then maybe your priest, your doctor, your shaman were encapsulated in one person. If that person could be destroyed, murdered, the cultural knowledge will then be cut off at the source, and the transmission was almost purely oral, as opposed to maybe in Southern America, when there was a more written tradition to a degree, but what the Spanish went after and destroyed were all the codices belonging to the peoples there. So by destroying their sense of history and their historical knowledge, they basically left the population open and vulnerable to the machinations of the imperial group. So fast forward to 1910 in the United States of America. There was something called the Flexner Report, which was Johns Hopkins sponsored report, which resulted in the standardization of medical education in the United States based upon a hyper-rational German model. Now, I'm not arguing here that there's a problem of rationality or scientific discourse, but medicine is more than a science. Medicine isn't a science, it rests upon sciences and other disciplines. But you had a group of people at that time, including J.D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Richard Carnegie and John Rockefeller, who formed quite a malevolent, malignant and unsavoury little cabal. And between them they carved up the United States at that time as an empire in the fields of education, oil, finance, pharmaceuticals. So the idea was for them, separately and intertwined, to be able to dominate those things. A little bit later down the road you had things like the repression of, or the making illegal of a natural medicine, cannabis, which had been used for millennia up to that point, and the whole sort of prohibition of that, which is only now being lifted with a massive amount of scientific research being conducted into its benefits, and that's making resurgence. We have a historical period of 100 years where a perfectly decent natural medicinal plant was illegal, and in its place, on the back of that hyper-rational medical model supposedly backed by science, you had situations like the ongoing opioid crisis in the American Midwest, which hot on its heels is followed by the heroin epidemic, as the opioid supplies are cut down, or people can't get enough because the tolerance grows. Then the black tar heroin from Mexico and that very successful operation comes in hot on the heels, and you have all the the attendant problems with that. So what we've seen since is the overexpression again, historically now, of this Panacea model, the sort of imperial control, if you like. If you think of medicine as an empire or as a Teamsters union or something like that, the idea is to control the ground, of thought, to control the ground of research, to really marginalise everything else to the point when there is, there are the crumbs from the table. The argument always being with medicine that arguments against natural medicine may be that there's no research that proves that. That's quite a disingenuous statement, generally, because the research hasn't been done, because the research hasn't been funded, because the funding is controlled by these interest groups through their universities, through the pharmaceutical companies, and so on and so forth. So these sort of disingenuous arguments don't really reveal the extent of the stitch-up, if you will, the unevenness of the playing field. So you have a population who, as it ages, is not really encouraged at any point to take responsibility for its own health. It's not taught about the body's physiology, the body's own immune system, and how that works, and what can be done to support that, and what can be done at its detriment. The idea really put out there is that we control this field, and you just carry on doing that. There are these products, there are these foods, it doesn't really matter. You keep doing what you're going to do, and when you break, we'll fix you, don't worry about that. And that's clearly been quite a successful model in terms of the finances and in terms of the control of the whole thought field. And then you get a situation that we have now when that model is being highlighted as unable to cope, and there's a great flurry of interest in rushing to find a vaccination, and at the moment rightly supporting the weakened health systems that we have and the weakened population that we have. The problem being that we shouldn't lose sight of is the situation as it is at the moment is a product of thought, behaviour, research, policy, all self-reinforcing an idea that lacks balance. It lacks balance. It's an idea that very much promotes, as I mentioned earlier, this the concept of not taking responsibility. So what we have is a self-supporting, self-referential group of ideas and institutions that really don't promote self-health responsibility, don't know how to promote it, and relegate it really to almost to the, and often this term's thrown around, to the realm of quackery. So it's a fascinating subject to sort of get into, to start to understand that what we consider as normal with medicine and healthcare isn't the only option out there, and the fact that regardless of the successes of medicine, there is an imbalance in the approach which, if redressed, would actually make the whole system even more effective. If you'd like to read a little bit more about these ideas, I've got 3 book recommendations for you. The first one is by far and away the most accessible. It's very interesting, very light-hearted. It's a great read. It's called Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan, who's a really interesting character, anthropologist, writer, traveller, really interesting guy, and a great book. Okay, the second book I want to look at is one that Chris Ryan's book draws quite heavily on. Now this is a far more dry and academic kind of work. It is Mark Nathan Cohen's Health and the Rise of Civilization. And this is an excellent book. Again, I'd only recommend it if you want to dive more deeply into the subject matter, because it is quite dry, and there's a lot of sort of analysis of data in it, but it looks at various extant human populations at the moment, and also compares them to paleontological records of extinct human groups, and looking at patterns of health disease, what kind of diseases they are prone to, what are their morbidity rates, their mortality rates, and then comparing them to sort of modern groups, farmer groups and industrialised groups and so on and so forth. So it really is a fascinating study, but it is, you know, only if you want to sort of dive more into the academic side of things. And thirdly and finally, I highly recommend this book, again, if you want to do a little bit more in-depth study. It's not an easy read. Often pages are 7/8 footnotes as opposed to text. It is highly referenced. Although it was written in 1976, I think you can take a lot of the data and the trends within it and just extrapolate them forward and magnify them, because you know very little has actually changed within sort of medical organisation and demographics at that point. And there's just a couple of little pieces I'd like to read from this for you. So it says, "But two things are certain. The professional practice of physicians cannot be credited with the elimination of old forms of mortality or morbidity, nor should it be blamed for the increased expectancy of life spent in suffering from new diseases. For more than a century, analysis of disease trends has shown that the environment is the primary determinant of the state of general health of any population. Medical geography, the history of diseases, medical anthropology, and the social history of attitudes towards illness have shown that food, water and air, in correlation with the level of socio-political equality and the cultural mechanisms that make it possible to keep the population stable, play the decisive role in determining how healthy grown-ups feel and at what age adults tend to die. Neither the proportion of doctors in a population nor the clinical tools at their disposal nor the number of hospital beds is a causal factor in the striking changes in overall patterns of disease. The new techniques for recognising and treating such conditions as pernicious anemia and hypertension, or for correcting congenital malformations by surgical intervention, redefine but do not reduce morbidity. The fact that the doctor population is higher where certain diseases have become rare has little to do with the doctor's ability to control or eliminate them. It simply means that doctors deploy themselves as they like, more so than other professionals, and they tend to gather where the climate is healthy, where the water is clean, and where the people are employed and can pay for their services." And in closing, another little quote from here. It says, "The medicalisation of prevention thus becomes another major symptom of another little quote here. The medicalisation of prevention thus becomes another major symptom of social iatrogenesis." Iatrogenesis is medical harm. "It tends to transform personal responsibility for my future into my management by some agency." And I think that's a good point to kind of close on there, that my responsibility for my health rests with me, and we should be very careful of giving up control of information or healthcare provision by some external agency, because I don't think there's an external agency out there that is entirely benevolent and doesn't have any agenda that it's following of its own. And one of my hopes, I think, from this whole coronavirus situation is that there can be a reawakening of personal responsibility and a rebalancing of this Panacea, Hygieia kind of axis, where people can start to gather more information, start to take control back, can look at the population in response to this disease. And I heard a statistic yesterday from a very reputable source. He was saying that 71.8, I believe, percent of patients with complications or death from COVID-19 were on the scale of obese to morbidly obese. It's not all of them, but 71% is a vast percentage of the group of those who've had real serious issues with that and also the underlying health conditions. So the opportunity to take control and invest in long-term health is there. The knowledge of how to do so is there, and the medical establishment isn't the sole arbiter and the sole gatekeeper of that knowledge, and actually lacks a lot of that knowledge because it's not been the path that it's followed. So if responsibility for personal health care is something that you're inspired to take on and develop, then you might need to reach out to other sources, therapists such as myself and my colleagues. We've certainly over the years, the tools at our disposal tend to be non-clinical, dietary, lifestyle, and the potentization of one's own physiology and immunity and the regulation thereof. And these things can all be achieved without recourse generally to medicine. But the point is, you need to take responsibility and you need to make the course corrections as you go, as opposed to allowing something to head towards rank pathology, where that's the point when you are going to need medical intervention, because you've pushed your physiological systems so far past a certain limit that there is structural and functional change which may or may not be reversible. So yeah, what I'm really hoping is that these conversations, these considerations will inspire you to begin to take a little more or a lot more responsibility for your own health. Understand that the population group that are most at risk and dying now may well be you in 10, 15, 20 years, unless you make some some very profound changes to the way that you live your life. And these changes need not be vastly difficult, vastly onerous, and they can be taken in small steps. It's like a buffet. No one expects you to eat the whole thing. And if you're on a cruise ship, obviously you don't eat from the buffet at all. But no one expects you to eat the whole thing. You go up and you pick a dish at a time. The same thing with taking control and responsibility for your health, is you gradually withdraw aspects of that, or bring them, or awaken them within you, or bring them back from external control, if you like. So the opportunity is there, and there's plenty of people out there in the world who are happy to have that sort of conversation with you, and using this pandemic as a springboard. If you're thinking about the vulnerable populations, how do you not become a future vulnerable population, or a member of a future vulnerable population, should I say? What are the steps that you start to take now that will mean by the time you reach your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that you don't have a host of comorbidities. You don't have a host of impediments to your health. You're not excessively carrying weight. You're not on a vast number of medications. Your heart's healthy. Your lung function is good. You know, you're strong. You're able to buffer and withstand a disease process that, by all reckoning, will still be with us for I don't see how it will not be for the ongoing future. When this becomes an endemic part of of our environment. So the flu naturally kills a lot of older and more vulnerable people every year, and this will be something else. So I think now is the time to start to really educate yourself, really make some changes, make those course corrections, and guard yourself as much as you can against future problems. Anyway, I hope you found this set of considerations interesting and insightful, and I will be back with some more in the next few days. Please obviously like and share. I'd love for you to leave a comment below, and I will speak to you soon. Okay, take care then.